Kia ora koutou. Welcome everybody. Hi everyone. My name's Craig Bunt, Professor of Agricultural Innovation. First speaker of the day. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Craig. And thank you for the opportunity to talk here today about building on-farm resilience and sustainability through multi-purpose trees and shrubs. I wanted to start with some observations around longevity. There's the recognition that farmers are more than landowners, they're also custodians for future generations. Something I was told early in my career as a forester is that forestry is an act of faith because of the timelines involved from planting to realising any value. To be an forester is to be an optimist. And then to paraphrase an ancient saying, a wise person plants a tree under whose shade they will not sit. And I think those worldviews are compatible. And much is made of the farming versus forestry, and it's not something I really subscribe to because with the right approach, they complement each other. But we also need to think of forestry of more than just pine woodlots, and that's something that I'll be covering today, although those pine woodlots and plantations have a key role to play. So how do we go about, there are some challenges with longevity. We're making decisions now for outcomes that are months, seasons, years, decades hence. We're making those decisions in an environment that places greater value on the here and now. And we're using financial tools that disadvantage long-term decision-making, i.e. your discounted cash flow analysis. We also live in a rapidly changing world. Climate change is impacting land use, and storm events are becoming more frequent and intensive, and it's needing to rethink our land use. We've got increased market demands for demonstrable sustainability. New Zealand's greenhouse gas, water and biodiversity policies are actually being touted as progressive by the EU Commission and a potential baseline for future agricultural policy in Europe. Fonterra's announcement this week that they need to make a green shift by 2030 is a direct response to their key markets demanding those types of initiatives. But we also operate in an era of political and regulatory uncertainty. Our incoming government is winding back many environmental policies and initiatives. So how will New Zealand reach its Paris commitments if we don't actually have the tools to achieve those targets? Will the removal of those policies impact our access to our recently signed free trade agreement with Europe? So how do we achieve those outcomes whilst sustaining a viable business? And I think one of the issues there is that it shows the risk of, relying on being responsive to policy. And my view there is that the sector itself needs to be more proactive in developing what the sector sees as it needs as sustainable ongoing agriculture practices. And this type of environment or this type of facility that we've got here at the university is key there. And I think one of the points that you need about that is that you actually need to have good data on your environmental initiatives on farm, spatially and temporally, in terms of water, vegetation, greenhouse gas balance, because that is actually what your markets are looking for. Yes, they'll take note of the fine, goals and objectives of a business, but what they'll actually be looking for is that demonstrable changes in sustainability practices. That's what the market's looking for. That's what you need to be able to deliver. So how do we build that on-farm resilience? I've got 3 questions here. One is, what do we want from our on-farm planting? What are the preconditions to establishing that successful on-farm planting? And how do we achieve, operationalise that long-term sustainable and viable on-farm planting? I've broken that down into financial and production and environmental, looking at the outcomes. Financially, we want a return on investment. We want a viable business. From a production point of view, we want to maintain or increase production, and we want to be able to diversify production. Environmental is looking about sustainable land use and being able to meet market and regulatory requirements. The benefits of doing that, of course, financially, is you remain in business. It helps support what is a remarkable lifestyle and may also then help with your succession planning. From a production point of view, it's that long-term viability and, again, succession. Environmentally, it's around water and soil quality and biodiversity. There's also some co-benefits there too, though. So successful financially allows you potentially to look at off-farm investment. It allows you to fund some of those other initiatives that you're looking at on farm from production and environmental perspective. From a production point of view, it's that long-term sustainable land use and the environmental benefits from that. And environmental, you have ongoing market access is going to become a requirement. Access to premium markets is a potential benefit there, and a social license to operate. And in fact, those environmental co-benefits feed directly back into the underlying financial viability of that business. So there's a lot of cross-referencing between those various outcomes, benefits, and co-benefits. So when we come to our preconditions, I'm not going to try and take you through all the information on that slide there, but you can see that if we look at it from a planting type, then you find that generally your financial benefits is from your woodlots or your carbon forestry investments. Your production benefits come from your shelter belt, paddock shade and shelter, your environmental, your riparian, your land stabilisation, your biodiversity. So how does that all fit in with the planting farm within the farmscape? If you're looking at it on a paddock by paddock basis, does it add more value to farming business than that piece of land costs? And what are the alternatives? Well-located and profitable woodlot provides income diversification and can help with succession. A permanent carbon forest might be an option on land that's better suited to a woodlot, but it's not profitable for a production forest. And that provides income while allowing you to focus your farming activities on that better land. Fencing and planting rough gullies and riparian zones can improve livestock management and movement. Well-placed and laid out paddock shade and shelter increases pasture and livestock productivity. Your rough paddocks that you use for lambing or for storm shelter may do that job better with the right use of additional shelter, which can help with your on-farm greenhouse gas balance. And your preconditions then are coming back to location, species suitability, and also a clear understanding of the analysis of the costs and benefits of doing those various types of planting. And I'm going to touch on woodlots and carbon because they're quite hot topics in the news at the moment in forestry and also in how it impacts the agricultural sector. You need to understand why you're investing. Is it for income diversification? Is it to help you fund succession? Is it because it's the best land use? Or is it a combination of all of those reasons? You need to think about scale, ideally probably 10 hectares or more, because it's got to be worthwhile for that harvesting contractor to come in and harvest that woodlot. You need to think about the location on the farm. So many diagrams I see of where you do different planting on farm. The woodlot is always up the back of the farm at the head of a gully. If you're paying $100,000 a kilometre for roading up to harvesting standard, that might be your profit from that woodlot. Okay? If that road then helps you develop a ring road or something, or a laneway that benefits your farming operation, you might be quite comfortable with that, but you need to understand that. You need to think about your harvesting costs, because it can be from less than $30 a tonne to more than $50 a tonne, depending on the layout and the slope of that land. You have to pay to get that equipment there. So if you're the only woodlot for 50 or 100 kilometres, that's a few $1,000s more to bring the crew in to do that work. You also need to think about how far you are from that point of sale. We're now getting close to 30 cents per tonne per kilometre to transport logs to a sawmill or to the export port. And 100 kilometres is typically your maximum haul distance. If you're doing more than that, then you've got to have something pretty special to sell to make it worthwhile. So you end up with a range of harvest transport costs from a little bit over $50 a tonne to over $120 a tonne. And depending on what the market's doing at that time, that may or may not be less than what it is that you earn from it. You may or may not make a profit. So we look at prices. Up until a couple of years ago, we were going through the first sustained period of generally strong prices that we'd seen in more than a decade in forestry in New Zealand. The last couple of years has seen some fairly wild fluctuations, up to close to 50% with some of these export grades. So what that does is you know, if you go back to that previous slide where you were looking at those harvest cost variabilities, if you're on a high cost site and you're trying to harvest at this point now, it might be incredibly hard for you to actually make a profit from that harvesting operation. So you end up with a range of stumpage values, which is the value to you as the forest owner of the log sales net, all the costs to get them to that point of sale. For pruned, on a lower to medium cost sites, it's not a bad return, $25 to $77 a tonne. But if you're on a high cost site, then you're sort of plus or minus $10 to $12. And it only takes a $10 shift in log prices for that slightly positive one to become zero or negative. Framing, it's not quite as optimistic because it's a lower average log value. There's no pruned logs included in that. And I guess the relevance of that point is that a lot of the carbon forests or the forestry that's being planted under averaging at the moment in the ETS, they are doing it as framing or a variation of framing because they're maximising volume growth to maximise NZUs, to maximise carbon income. And they're not looking at what happens when that carbon income stops. Because under averaging, you've only got 60 years and forever and a day after that, the only money you're going to make from that woodlot is when you harvest it every 25 to 30 years. So I've tried to pull this together into some numbers. I've got there assumed $10,000 a hectare land cost, which is expensive, but people in other parts of the country, well, even down here, at the height of the carbon forestry madness, we're paying up to $15,000 a hectare for bare land to go into trees. In parts of the North Island, they were paying over $20,000. Now, if your carbon runs out after 16 years and you've only got stumpage income left after that, then you're effectively looking at the equivalent of a pre-90 forest. And pre-90 forest lands, because that's the only income you make from it, is worth at best $5,000 a hectare, and even that's probably paying too much. So after 16 years, you effectively have a 50% or more capital write-down in capital land value, which is a non-deductible loss. And I don't know that your accountant or your bank manager would be that thrilled with that. So the table here is looking at, for somebody who's bought the land, we're looking at 3-year average log prices. And if you just remember back to the graph over the last couple of years, we've been under that 3-year average more than above it. And we're looking at the rate of the return in two situations. The first is for when we've got it registered in the ETS and we're earning income from averaging, or under averaging carbon. And those returns for pruned of 5 to nearly 8%, well, that looks pretty good. Even for your framing, it looks pretty good because of the impact of how discounted cash flow analysis works, is it's only really looking at those first 15 or 16 years and doesn't care what happens after that. But what happens when that carbon income's gone is that those rates of return drop to quite low levels. And I don't think nearly enough people are looking at the impact of what happens once that carbon income has stopped. The other clear message then is that you get your best returns from pruned woodlots on low to medium cost harvesting and transport. So easy to rolling hill country, close to main roads and within 100 k's of a port. And the farmers in this room will be very familiar about what sort of land that is. And in fact, that's your best sheep and beef land as well. So it's a really interesting conundrum, that one. If we look at the carbon side of things, again, we need to understand why. Is it a financial investment? Is it to meet your ETS obligations? Is it as part of an on-farm greenhouse gas balance? We need to understand that the ETS, when it was initially designed, was designed for plantation forestry. Okay? It was explicitly stated at the time that it was first set up that it was not intended or suited for agriculture. New Zealand was going to meet all its international obligations through to 2050 by planting another 200,000 hectares of pine forests in the decade from the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s. And instead, the government pursued policies that helped crash the price, which meant that very little new forest was planted, and people took advantage of cheap credits to deforest maybe 200,000 hectares. So we end up with the Billion Trees program because we find out 15 years down the track we've got a problem, and how do we plug that hole? We're also getting pushback against using forestry offsets. You might not have seen that this week Toitu has announced that we're not accepting NZUs for its carbon reduced or its carbon zero programs. But they will accept on-farm vegetation as part of an on-farm greenhouse gas balance program, but just not for the issuance of credits. One of the issues then for agriculture in the ETS, and I guess it depends on where He Waka Eke Noa ends up, but it is effectively forcing farmers to join the ETS, because that's the only way that you can monetize sequestration on your farm to meet your emissions liabilities. But as I said, the ETS wasn't actually designed for agriculture. And you've got issues like the definitions in there. So in New Zealand, we've got a definition of a forest as more than a hectare of species that grow to more than 5 metres in height and 30% canopy cover. And that's designed around plantation forests. And how much vegetation is on your farm that is less than a hectare, less than 5 metres in height and less than 30% canopy cover is quite a bit. The IPCC rules actually allow 0.1 of a hectare, 2 metres and 10% canopy cover. And the view in New Zealand was that, well, you're not going to get much sequestration out of that. And anyway, it was focused on plantation forestry, not vegetation on farms. But it still sequesters. It still contributes to your on-farm greenhouse gas balance. So that's important. If we look here at, I've just got those two graphs there for your carbon growth rates and your discount factors to explain why the attraction is on pine forestry and other indigenous species. You look at radiata, very fast growth rate initially. It is a colonizing species, but you only earn it through to age 16 years. But if you look at that discount curve at 6%, that's still 0.4 or better. Your indigenous species will actually sequester, and the indigenous table is it's the MPI generic table, so it's focused around scrub species, manuka, a little bit of totara, things like that. But even so, over 50 years, it will sequester more than that pine. But at 50 years, at a 6% discount rate, that's only a discount factor of 0.05. So that means that anything that you earn from that is virtually meaningless in today's dollars term. This is what I was meaning, saying we're using financial tools that disadvantage long-term thinking and long-term decision-making. The other interesting point out of that graph is you look at the wee bars there, that's from some work from Tane's Tree Trust, looking at sequestration rates on different native tree species, so totara, beech, rimu, miro. And in fact, they will deliver you significantly higher sequestration rates and for longer than just your scrub. So there are ways of approaching that you might be able to use in any carbon sink forestry or indigenous forestry on farms. So we then need to actually think about it in terms of more than just a single rotation. Sorry if this is a little bit, what I'm looking at here is what's your earnings comparison between your pine woodlots under averaging and native forest over time in terms of an annual cash and in terms of cumulative cash over 2 rotations. What that shows you, and we're assuming this is on a medium harvest cost site, 3-year average prices, $70 an NZU and 3% annual growth. Well, we've gone through the next couple of years, 3% annual growth in the week or so since I put this slide together. So the prices are on their way back up. Pine under averaging has strong early income from those NZUs through to age 16. You'll see the spike there on that top graph from the periodic harvesting income, and in between times it's actually a net cost. Indigenous is slow early income because of those slow initial growth rates. But over the long term, and especially if you're looking at that in a cumulative sense, you could argue that that's comparable. Remembering that this is just off the scrub table, you may actually be able to engineer your forest to sequester at a higher rate. And it also doesn't take account of the fact that you may get a biodiversity premium through having native forest. We know that this is happening already. People I've spoken to are saying they're getting a 10–15% premium already for NZUs that come from native forest. Which brings me to on-farm greenhouse gas balance. The average farm size in New Zealand, I think, is somewhere between 300 and 500 hectares. So total emissions, 1,500, 2,500. So I've used 2,000 there. I know it includes methane. I know there's discussion around split gas approaches, but if you're looking at some sort of certification at this point of an on-farm greenhouse gas balance, then you have to take account of your methane. And this reflects an exercise that I did with a farmer looking at how they would work towards being greenhouse gas neutral on farm with no change in their emissions profile. And if you did that as woodlots, recognizing that you can only register those and use them in averaging, and you only get 16 years of carbon out of that, then it means that you have to periodically plant to maintain a profile of sequestration. So that's that first graph. There's five lots of planting over about 15–20 years. 100 hectares of the farm disappears into woodlots, and cumulatively you get no more than maybe 50% of your net emission, of your gross emissions covered by that sequestration. And in this farmer's case, it was actually more than 100 hectares, and he was losing 20% of his farm. And it was like, am I a farmer anymore? You could take a woodlot approach to that. So there's a mix there of 20 hectares of radiata, 5 years later, 30 hectares of softwoods, and 5 years later, 50 hectares of indigenous. So you've still lost effectively 100 hectares of your farm. You still get to about 50% of your gross emissions, but it is over a longer period of time. So it's perhaps a slightly better outcome. But of course, the farmer wanted to farm and he didn't want to lose productive area. So we took a different approach. There were streams in the farm, so we could get a small amount of riparian planting. Farmer had an extensive network of laneways to bring his stock back into his yards. So you're planting either side of those laneways with deciduous hardwood tree species that give shade on those laneways. And that worked out as roughly 15 hectares, but it's not 15 hectares of fully stocked forest. It's 15 hectares of more widely spaced. So it's not sequestering at the full per hectare rate, but it still makes a significant contribution, as you can see there. The other thing we then looked at was what he could do around, it was an intensive sheep farm, so there's a good amount of fencing and paddocks and those sorts of things. Again, was wide spaced trees along those fence lines for paddock shade and shelter at a even lower per hectare rate of sequestration estimated for that. But you can see that, and both of those plantings was over an extended period of time. I think we're still looking at planting in 2040, 2050. But what that does is that it actually gets you a better overall sequestration value and over a longer period of time, and no anticipated drop-off in productive area on that farm. The issue, the ETS won't recognise that. He Waka Eki Noa won't recognise that. But your on-farm greenhouse gas balance certification scheme will recognise that, and your market will recognise that. I think those last two are the more important ones. Or either that, or you lose those last two to inform not necessarily the ETS, but certainly how they deal with agriculture and agricultural emissions. So how do we achieve this? I mean, farming has enough risks. So it's about trying to look for what those lower risk solutions are and what those solutions are compatible with your farming system. It's and it'll be a mix of match depending on that farm and that farming system. But well-located, managed and profitable production woodlots have a function to play. If they're able to be ETS registered, the ETS is your cream. That's your sort of once-in-a-life opportunity to make something extra out of that and invest that money into things that will improve the productivity and the environmental outcomes on your farms, or even some longer term sequestration with pure carbon investment. And as I said before, that might be on the same sort of land that previously you might have considered for a woodlot, but it's not profitable to harvest. So the permanent carbon forest has an opportunity there. Your productivity is your shelter belts, your paddock shade and shelter, and you incorporate your pollinator support planting in that. Your environmental is your riparian and your land stabilisation and so forth. Got some photos to follow just to show you some examples of that. I'm not going to put up any photos of woodlots. I think you all know what they look like. And many of you will already be doing the sort of things that I'm talking about here. And I'm really just, what I'm seeking to do here is to reinforce what you're doing, but also highlight some of that wider type of benefits that you get from that. So your shelter belts come in various shapes and forms. They can be single row with alternate low shrubs and tall trees, or if you've got enough space, you've got a double row with a evergreen low shelter hedging on the windward side and your taller deciduous on the leeward side there, and a preference for using deciduous because you can get you shade in the summer, but you're not overly shading your pasture in winter. Or you can go to what I call a three-tier approach, and this is one that was developed for the Trees for Bees work I'm involved with, where you've got more of your bee forage on that leeward side. So here's some examples here, and I think the left-hand photo there's an interesting one because in a previous life that was a pine shelter belt that was harvested. You can see it is on flat land. That gap in the trees at the far end is about 50 metres from a state highway to an export port, which is only about 100 kilometres away. So you'd think, brilliant, that's going to make them a lot of money. They made enough to re-fence the shelter belt and make a bit of a contribution towards the replanting cost. Because with shelter belts, you get a lot of edge trees, you'll get a lot of big knots. Because it's a shelter belt, it probably gets knocked about by the wind. So it's one of the disadvantages. I mean, you can trim them up and hedge them, great, but there's a disadvantage there that if you think that you're going to harvest them and make good money out of them, the returns may be less than expected. So the farmer in this case said, well, I'm not going to do that again. And it's in an area where there was potential for irrigation and a pivot. So we're looking at shelter that's going to be able to have a pivot pass over the top of that. They've got beekeeping associated with that, so they wanted good bee forage in there. And what we've done with it, that's a Michaelia that's flowering, and it's got some hardy, slower growing shrubs on the left on the windward side, and that's working really well. Again, the one in the middle there, single row shelter belt. So low growing manuka for that low shelter and interspersed with alders to give you that deciduous high shelter. That's working really well there. And the good thing with the alders, you know, the poplars are a very wide spreading rooting, and they get through the fence and make a mess of the edge of your paddock. Alders roots go straight down. And the one on the right hand side was another one where a pine shelter belt had disappointed at time of harvest, and so they wanted something that was more resilient longer term. So we've got a mixture of oaks and maples, all sorts of things in there. And again, it's the benefit for them is that it's part of the shelter and the shade for the paddock, and it incorporates bee forage for the local beekeeper. You can do plenty of things with your paddock shade and shelter. Just run a hot wire across the corner of a fence, or put a post out a couple of meters into your paddock and either run timber around that or run a hot wire around that. The farm that I was talking about with his paddock shade and shelter, that was the sort of plan that we were looking there, was doing that at 20 metre centres along a fence line. You can make them a little bit bigger if you want to put in some shrubs for low shelter or for bee forage, but that can work really well. So there's a couple of examples there. That's probably more the Rolls-Royce end of them. They can be quite expensive if you're wanting to do that with timber rails and that, but in this case, that one on the right-hand side, they've got cattle in there, so they need to keep them back off the trees. If you've got horses, I think I'm told they've got a 7-foot reach, and they love trees. So you need to think about those sorts of things, but there's you know, there's good things that you can do with that. Your laneways, is talked about those before, but and I mean, on the left-hand side there, that was a main thoroughfare through the farm. They wanted to make a bit of a statement, so they've got a glorious row of mana ash underplanted with lavender. I mean, not everybody's got the time and energy to do that, but it was quite a spectacular outcome. The one in the middle was a little bit more modest in its aspirations, but it was quite a bit longer, and that's just putting up some stakes, and they had to put a bit of wind cloth around that because it's a fairly exposed site, just to allow those trees to get established. And I'm sure that there's some keen duck shooters amongst you. Instead of just having willows around your duck pond, you can use crab apples and oaks, because then you've got the food source to bring your ducks in, as well as to guide the flight path. And in all of these cases, that type of vegetation is something that can be captured as part of your on-farm greenhouse balance. So there's a whole range of benefits that you get out of that. Everybody knows about riparian. And it's a really interesting one, because the farmer here, it was to do with water quality. It's the headwaters of a catchment that's got some significant issues. But also he was having problems with that gully, with stock on the far side getting down and not getting back out again. So we took that opportunity to fence, leave the fence on this side, run a fence down the far side, and we've planted that with a mixture of natives. Not at 1 metre centres. I'm a forester, so we did forestry planting. So 1,000 stems per hectare, so it's rather more manageable. I keep seeing these ones, people saying, oh, it's $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a hectare to establish native vegetation. It's not, right? It's more than pines, but you can do it for between $3,000 and $5,000 a hectare. One of the outcomes of this too is that right-hand photo is about 5 years of age, 4 or 5 years of age. There's still plenty of grass in there for intercepting surface runoff before it gets to the watercourse. I've been in ones that have been established at metre centres at a similar age, and the ground is dead underneath, and the farmer's not happy. And again, bee forage, you can keep the beekeeper in there while the clover's in flower, and self-seeding clover pasture. He's not having to regrass that every 5 or 10 years. Left-hand slide is a deep incised waterway. The fences were pulled back a bit further from that to give a decent enough space to put good sized shrub and tree species in there, so we get paddock shade and shelter as well as riparian protection. The right-hand side allowed the farmer to actually shift from having to move stock from paddock to paddock, put a laneway in. Land stabilisation, that's a slope you wouldn't want to try and walk on to plant anything, because if you tripped and fell, you wouldn't wake up when you hit the bottom. I don't know if you can quite see on the top there, and there's a wee bit of white. It's tree lucerne, and it's seeding down the bank, and in fact, it's a great cover for native revegetation. In the recent storms, the slope where that where that vegetation was great. The problem was the big old men pine trees next to it got blown over and pulled half the hillside down with it. Another case here where we have a wet escarpment, a boundary fence on the right hand side there. That was just a nightmare to maintain. So a fence along the solid part of the top of the escarpment there. I suppose you could have put a pine woodlot in there, but it's unstable land and it probably wouldn't have been a very good pine plantation, so they filled it up with a mixture of native and exotic species to stabilise that escarpment, greenhouse gas or ETS eligible, and bee forage. So, building on farm resilience. Well located and profitable woodlots with carbon as the cream. Carbon forests where it's a best land use. Integrate that on-farm planting for shade and shelter, riparian protection and land stability. Do that with a diverse species mix of exotic, indigenous and bee forage species and establish it over time. You don't want to try and do everything at once. One of the things I talk about, I said before, a pine woodlot with ETS registration might be great because that then actually gives you some cash flow to help you do these other things. And you aim for low-risk solutions compatible with your farm systems. There's a couple of links there. Some of my work's with the Trees for Bees Research Trust. We produced a good handbook a couple of years ago, and okay, it's focused on bee forage, but there's actually a lot of really good advice there for farmers about establishing vegetation on farms. Anyway, thank you, and any questions?